Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Red Menace. This is episode number 5, and this week we are covering the text by Lenin entitled Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. As always, if you like what we do here on Red Menace, you can support us and get bonus content at patreon.com/The Red Menace, or follow us on Twitter at red_menace_pod. Alyson, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. My house is a little bit of a mess, so I'm not quite in the usual setup that we're doing. We're moving, so we took down the bookshelves that I usually use for a backdrop, so we'll see how that goes, but...
For sure. All right, so do you want to just jump into section 1, or do you have anything to say before we start?
Not really. No, I'm down to just jump in.
All right, we got a lot to tackle, so let's do it.
Awesome. Okay, so, yeah, left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Lenin starts this text by looking basically at the successes that the Bolsheviks had and trying to make a case that those successes have basically universal importance. So Lenin really begins by looking at this idea of universal significance for the Russian Revolution. He's really concerned with demonstrating that the successes of the Bolsheviks have international import for all communist struggle across the world, and he argues that at least some of them need to be pretty much universally repeatable in all contexts. So in order to do this, he picks a few different facets of Bolshevik strategy in order to tease out what they are and why they should be universally applicable. So the first that he looks at in terms of international significance and applicability is the need for what he calls the strictest and truly iron discipline within the party. What Lenin sees as important for the Bolshevik strategy is that it revealed that bourgeois resistance increases significantly after revolution, and therefore discipline is necessary for long-term proletarian victory against counter-revolution. So we've talked about this some before, but again, in the context of the Russian Revolution, not only did you see the deposed bourgeoisie within Russia fighting against the party, but you also saw the international bourgeoisie come in and fight in the Russian Civil War. And so for that, Lenin thinks that this form of discipline and actual party strictness is really important for overcoming that. And so the second internationally significant thing that Lenin points out is what he calls the need for centralization. Specifically, the Bolshevik approach to centralization follows from the existence of a proletarian vanguard, which again, we've talked about the vanguard before and what is to be done. This vanguard is not, of course, just in contact with the proletariat, but unites all the other dispossessed masses together in a struggle against capitalism. And this vanguard actually creates centralization through educating and persuading the masses through their own experiences of class struggle and showing the superiority of a Marxist method in that context. So these are the two universal aspects of Bolshevik strategy that Lenin really opens with. But Bolshevism still did emerge within a historically specific time frame, and Lenin is attentive to that. He writes, quote, "Bolshevism arose in 1903 on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. The correctness of this revolutionary theory, and it alone, has been proved not only by the world experience throughout the 19th century, but especially by the experience of the seekings and vacillations, the errors and disappointments of revolutionary thought in Russia. For about half a century, approximately from the 40s to the 90s of the last century, progressive thought in Russia, oppressed by a most brutal and reactionary Tsarism, sought eagerly for a correct revolutionary theory, and followed with the utmost diligence and thoroughness each and every last word in the sphere in Europe and America. Russia achieved Marxism, the only correct revolutionary theory, through the agony she experienced in the course of half a century of unparalleled torment and sacrifice, of unparalleled revolutionary heroism, incredible energy, devoted searching, study, practical trial, disappointment, verification, and comparisons with the European experience." End quote. What's important for Lenin is, despite the fact that Bolshevism is something that emerged out of the peculiarities and the specificities of Russian struggle, is that it moves beyond that and can speak to the struggle globally, and in fact happens in comparison to how the struggle occurs elsewhere, in order to clarify Marxism and help create a universally applicable theory. So in order to provide more historical depth for this, Lenin then looks at what he sees as the stages of Bolshevik strategy in the context of Russia. This kind of is going to mirror the discussion that we talked about with Foundations of Leninism, where Stalin mirrors these same stages of the revolution that Lenin discusses here. So the first was the Preparatory Stage from 1903 to 1905, so the early revolutionary period in Russia. And during this stage, Lenin said the ideological struggle between different factions really began to emerge. You had the big bourgeois and small bourgeois bourgeois who were pushing for forms of liberalism or types of socialism that would leave the bourgeois intact, and then you had the proletarian camp that was demanding actual proletarian revolution and the establishment of socialist society. So later on, as time moved forward, there's what he calls the First Revolutionary Phase, which was from 1905 to 1907. During this time period, the strategy changed a little bit because there were actually many assassination attempts and revolutionary attempts against the Tsar and attempts to overthrow the government. And this led to the Tsar establishing the Duma, or the Russian Parliament, which was basically a way of tossing a bone, mostly to the bourgeois and the progressive democratic forces, of saying, oh, we'll let you have some power within Russia. But it was largely insignificant. And it was during this period of time that the Bolsheviks strategically vacillated from boycotting or not boycotting the Duma, depending on what they saw as strategic. And Lenin says it was in this period of time that they realized that it took both legal and illegal forms of organizing and work in order to really push back against the state, and that you had to be able to move between both based on determination of what the best strategy in a given moment was. After this, there's what Lenin calls the Reactionary Stage, which occurred from 1907 to 1910, and this was when the Tsar really actually clamped down on revolutionary activity in Russia. Lenin and many others actually had to flee at this time and leave the country, and Lenin says that the Bolsheviks learned another really crucial lesson during this period, which is that retreat is just as important as attacking, and that you cannot always be on the offensive. You have to be able to make an assessment of what is best, and if retreat is what is best for the survival of the movement, then that is the decision that you need to make. So after this, there was a stage of revival that Lenin says is when the Bolsheviks really began to gain some power and distance themselves from a lot of the pro-bourgeois politics of the Mensheviks. They also distinguished themselves, again, by defending a mixture of both legal and illegal work, not going with the people who only wanted purely legal above-ground work, but also pushing back against more anarchist elements who wanted only illegal action. Then finally you had what Lenin says is the period of the Imperialist War and Revolution. So when Russia went into World War I, and this created a really acute crisis within the political situation of Russia, this led to the February Revolution, which was a bourgeois revolution against the Tsar that overthrew the Tsar and established a provisional government with a constituent assembly. So during this time, you had the successful bourgeois revolution, and Russia then, it was up in the air whether or not it would develop into a bourgeois republic or further socialist development would occur. This again is where the Bolsheviks distinguished themselves from the right opportunist lines of the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, both by insisting on total revolution, the idea that you couldn't stop at the bourgeois revolution, but had to push through to a proletarian revolution, and for their opposition to the imperialist World War I. What was unique about them in this instance was they were the ones who opposed imperialism and stood for internationalism and revolutionary defeatism. So Lenin emphasizes that during this time, the Bolsheviks did have a period of boycott on parliament and opposition to participation in this. But Lenin says that this was strategic, not out of principle per se, but in order to create a greater crisis and allow the party to push forward. And Lenin argues that eventually the Bolsheviks came around to participating in the Constituent Assembly under the justification that, quote, a bourgeois republic with the Constituent Assembly is better than a bourgeois republic without one, end quote. And so Lenin gives us the historical path that Bolshevism developed on. He then tries to distinguish Bolshevik methods from the other groups within the working class movement at the time. So first he distinguishes it again from the petty bourgeois revolutionaries, and in this instance Bolshevism was distinguished by its insistence on the vanguard status of the proletariat, not the supposedly progressive role of the liberal small owning class. He also then distinguishes Bolshevism from anarchism, because Bolshevism rejected completely illegal work and also insisted that the use of a revolutionary state was important. Lenin makes an interesting statement here where he doesn't totally blame anarchists for their more ultra-left stances, in fact saying that anarchism functioned as, quote, a sort of punishment for the opportunist sins of the working class movement, end quote. Because the working class movement had gone so far right and had engaged in so much opportunism, anarchism in Lenin's mind was actually kind of a natural response that had to be worked past, and the Bolsheviks worked to do this. Bolshevism, of course, also distanced itself from the followers of economism, who believed in a organic development of the working class movement by instead insisting on the need for a vanguard that could lead the working class into correct Marxist theory. Finally, Lenin says that Bolshevism had to purge internal left-wing elements who insisted on electoral and parliamentary boycotts as a universal strategy. Lenin says that these left-wing communists within the Bolsheviks did not understand that the original Bolshevik boycott of the Duma in 1905 was strategic to that very specific moment. The crucial distinguishing insight for Bolsheviks is rather that combining legal and illegal work is necessary, and boycotts or participations are strategic tools to be deployed in specific contexts. Lenin writes, quote, "The conclusion then is clear. To reject compromises on principle, to reject the permissibility of compromises in general, no matter of what kind, is childishness, which it is difficult to even consider seriously. A political leader who desires to be useful to the revolutionary proletariat must be able to distinguish concrete cases of compromises that are inexcusable and are expressions of opportunism and treachery. He must direct all the forces of criticism, the full intensity of merciless exposure and relentless war against these concrete compromises, and not allow the past masters of practical socialism and the parliamentary Jesuits to dodge and wriggle out of the responsibility by means of discussions of compromises in general." So for Lenin, what's important is that there are times when we have to compromise. There are times when we have to participate within reactionary institutions, and we need to develop the tools to distinguish between compromises that are forced by objective material conditions and compromises that represent a right-wing trend within the party and the movement. And only distinguishing that can allow us to come to an actual scientific and adaptive understanding of socialism.
Exactly right. So in Chapter 5, Lenin begins to lay out the specifics of what he means by left-wing communism. And he uses the German Communist Party, specifically its ultra-left faction, which split off from the Communist Party and formed the Communist Workers' Party of Germany right before this text by Lenin was published, as its representative, saying that they, quote, "exhibit all the symptoms of the infantile disorder of leftism," end quote. The subheading of this chapter, entitled Leaders, Party, Class, and Masses, indicate the primary concepts that Lenin will be focusing on and clarifying in this chapter, because these are the main concepts that the German lefts, as Lenin refers to them, are deeply confused about. He quotes extensively from the German left pamphlet entitled, quote, "The Split in the Communist Party of Germany, the Spartacus League," end quote, to give us the core content of their positions. In the pamphlet, the German lefts reject all forms of strategic compromise with other political formations. They reject all forms of parliamentarianism, and they even reject tactical maneuvering as a form of compromise. They argue that there is actually a sharp distinction between what they call the Communist Party of the leaders and the Communist Party of the masses. The former is clearly a reference to the Bolshevik-style vanguard party, arguing that such a party is separate from and above the masses and is therefore in conflict with them. This argument is nothing new for us Marxists in the 21st century. We constantly hear from both left communists as well as anarchists that the vanguard party is elitist, is wholly separate from the working class, and therefore it represents an authoritarian cadre of tyrants more than it represents the working class itself. The lefts go on to argue that the party of leaders strives to organize from above, while their party of the masses, quote, "expects an upsurge of the revolutionary struggle from below," end quote, and rejects all methods and strategies except their singular method of ruthlessly overthrowing the bourgeoisie, as they put it. After laying this all out, Lenin says, quote, "Any Bolshevik who has consciously participated in or has closely observed the development of Bolshevism since 1903 will at once say, after reading these arguments, what old and familiar rubbish, what ultra-left childishness," end quote. But then he transitions into a detailed analysis of the claims made in the pamphlet, deconstructing them one by one. He begins by focusing on the supposed distinction between the party of leaders and the party of the masses. Lenin argues that the masses are not a homogeneous group, but are split themselves into different classes. And classes matter, as they occupy different strata of society and as such have different interests. Moreover, he argues that classes are most often led by political parties whose leadership is populated with the most respected, influential, and experienced members of that class who have the class's support. If those leaders did not have the class's support, they wouldn't exist in the first place, almost by definition. Therefore, the hypersimplistic distinction between leaders and the masses is premised on confusion and represents a sort of erroneous imposition of an idealist division onto proletarian movements. Lenin says that, quote, "the mere presentation of the question as between the dictatorship of the party or the dictatorship of the class, as between the party of the leaders or the party of the masses, testifies to the most incredible and hopeless confusion of the mind," end quote. This is the sort of non-nuanced and naive analysis that Lenin will attack throughout this text from many different angles. Moreover, Lenin says that under this fallacious division between leaders and the masses as wholly unconnected things, leaders don't cease to exist. New leaders just take their place under the cover of the slogan, "Down with all leaders." And they often just cease to be official and are thus not as accountable to the masses that they are ostensibly inseparable from. This also gives rise to a lack of vision and strategic coherency over the long term, which is why such organizations are rarely able to challenge, let alone defeat, capitalist and imperialist hegemony over any significant period of time. Lenin drives this point home by asserting, quote, "What the German left opposition has come to is the repudiation of the party principle and of party discipline, and this is tantamount to completely disarming the proletariat for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. It is tantamount to that petty bourgeois diffusiveness, instability, incapacity for sustained effort, unity, and organized action which, if indulged in, must inevitably destroy every proletarian revolutionary movement. From the standpoint of communism, the repudiation of the party principle means leaping from the eve of the collapse of capitalism in Germany, not to the lowest or intermediate, but to the highest phase of communism. We in Russia, in the third year since the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, are taking the first steps in the transition from capitalism to socialism, or the lowest stage of communism. Classes have remained, and will remain everywhere, for years after the conquest of power by the proletariat." End quote. So, in summary, by effectively defining the party out of existence via a rejection of leadership, the German left comms are denying the need for any transition period, and are attempting to leap straight from capitalism to communism. And this idea represents not a truer or more legitimate Marxism, but a rejection of core Marxist principles and a generalized refusal to take the difficult and challenging work of strategy and tactics seriously. And all of this in favor of what amounts to little more than sloganeering, covering up and ignoring the difficulties of reality in favor of phrase-mongering and purity politics. In Chapter 6, Lenin asked the question, should revolutionaries work in reactionary trade unions? The question arises because another core tenet of the German lefts is the total rejection of working within trade unions. In their pamphlet, they propose replacing trade unions with what they call a workers' union, and embracing all workers who follow the slogan, quote, "Leave the trade unions," end quote. He uses the Bolshevik experience as an example of why this a priori rejection of trade unions is childish and deeply counterproductive. He talks about how, at the time of writing this work, the Bolsheviks have a membership of over 600,000 party members, and the party relies on and works closely with the trade unions, which boast an official membership of over 4 million, and which are formally non-party, meaning that the trade unions themselves are not branches of the party, but operate in close connection with the party via directing bodies and the Central Trade Union Council. Thus, Lenin remarks, quote, "On the whole, we have a formally non-communist, flexible, relatively wide and powerful proletarian apparatus, by means of which the party is closely linked up with the class and with the masses, and by means of which, under the leadership of the party, the dictatorship of the class is manifested. Without close contact with the trade unions, without their hearty support and self-sacrificing work, not only in the economic but also in military affairs, it would, of course, have been impossible for us to govern the country and to maintain the dictatorship of the proletariat for 2 months, let alone 2 years." End quote. He goes on to highlight the complexities of this relationship and talks about the need for continued agitation and propaganda inside the unions, as well as regular conferences between the party and trade union leaders and rank-and-file members. In addition, all the work of the party is carried on through the Soviets, which embrace the toiling masses regardless of occupation or employment status, and these Soviets are intensely and unprecedented democratic institutions. Through these Soviets and their congresses, the party works to educate and appoint class-conscious workers to all sorts of posts, especially in rural districts, and in this way organic proletarian leadership is genuinely established. Left communists who reject all of this by arguing that the party is separate from and rules over workers fundamentally misunderstand the reality of the Soviet project and the deep-seated relationship between the masses, the class, the party, and the hyper-democratic Soviets. After laying out how all of these structures and institutions are shaped and function, Lenin says, quote, "Such is the general mechanism of the proletarian state power viewed, quote-unquote, from above, from the standpoint of the practical realization of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is to be hoped that the reader will understand why, to a Russian Bolshevik who is acquainted with this mechanism and who for 25 years has watched it growing out of small, illegal underground circles, all talk about from above versus from below, and all talk about the difference between the party of the leaders and the party of the masses, cannot but appear to be ridiculous and childish nonsense. Something like discussing whether the left leg or the right arm is more useful to a human being." End quote. And that's the essential bit that's still relevant to this very day. Marxist-Leninists do not favor a top-down approach over a bottom-up approach. That distinction is overly simplistic and not at all representative of the way that successful Marxist movements operate. And as Lenin shows us in this chapter, the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of the Soviets, and the deep connection between the party and the masses via institutions like trade unions are indicative of a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach to revolution and building socialism. This is something that always exists in ML movements, and it's something that Mao took very seriously and experimented with in world historical ways. Any anti-Leninist argument that props up this artificial division is either operating in bad faith or in deep confusion. In some ways, one could argue that this vibrant bottom-up democracy was eroded over time, and we can certainly have that argument. But when it comes to the Bolshevik Revolution and those early years of the socialist transition, it was a deeply democratic affair, and workers had more control over their own lives in those years than they've ever had before. At this point in the text, Lenin begins to talk about and sketch out the evolution of trade unions over time, how they were a tremendous step for the working class at the beginning of the development of capitalism, and how they can evolve under socialism. He says that the party, once in power, should help educate and guide the trade unions, while at the same time recognizing that the trade unions are a sort of quote-unquote school of communism, which acts as a preparatory school for training workers to exercise their power and their dictatorship. But, he adds, this is a long and protracted process overall, and the left communists who think you can jump from capitalism to communism are wrong in the same way that it's wrong to think you can teach advanced physics to a toddler. There are steps in between that must be taken, and a process that must be navigated. The rejection of this process, the idealism of assuming one can jump straight from capitalism to communism while rejecting the party form and rejecting all work within trade unions, is a core error and confusion of German left comms at this time. Moreover, Lenin argues that a certain reactionariness in trade unions, even under the dictatorship of the proletariat, is inevitable. To not understand this is to fall prey to the very same error of rejecting a transition period. But to fear this reactionariness, to avoid it, to try and sweep it under the rug or ignore it entirely, is a grave mistake, for it is synonymous with fearing and avoiding the duty of communists and the proletarian vanguard to train, educate, enlighten, and develop the most backward strata of the working class. In short, it's refusing to do the necessary work of building socialism. And the hidden premise of this error, the obscured underbelly of this mistaken approach, is that it assumes that we may have to postpone the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat until a time when every worker has overcome their myopic self-interest, reactionary instincts, or other prejudices. It is, in effect, to push the necessity of communism beyond the horizon until we have better workers to work with. Lenin sums up his opposition to this line of thought well when he says that, quote, "We must begin to build socialism not with imaginary human material, not with human material invented by us, but with the human material bequeathed to us by capitalism. That is very difficult, it goes without saying, but no other approach to this task is serious enough to warrant discussion. For the whole task of the communists is to be able to convince the backward elements, to work among them, and not to fence themselves off from them by artificial and childish left slogans." End quote. In short, less pompous phrases, less utopian declarations, less a priori purity politics, and more plain everyday work. After all, you don't win over the masses by abandoning, out of fear and difficulty, this necessary work. Rather, it's imperative for us communists to work wherever the masses are to be found. As I descend to the end of this section, I want to point something out that I found to be a wonderful and often underappreciated part of this chapter. We all know that Mao synthesized the concept of the mass line into formal theory, but it is here, in this work by Lenin, where you can see him outlining this very concept. On page 33, Lenin says, quote, "We consider that contact with the masses through trade unions is not enough. Our practical experience during the course of the revolution has given rise to non-party workers and peasant conferences, and we strive by every means to support, develop, and extend these institutions in order to be able to watch the sentiments of the masses, to come closer to them, to respond to their requirements, to promote the best among them to posts, etc." End quote. This is, without a doubt, and in direct conflict with so much of the stereotypes aimed at him, a testament to Lenin's sincere desire and attempt to tie the party to the masses in a dialectical way. and as someone who deeply appreciates, values, and understands the necessity of implementing the mass line, it was thrilling to come across this passage. In conclusion, what Lenin is critiquing as left communism in these chapters often consists in making the following general error. It too often prioritizes a priori abstract principles and slogans over detailed analysis, strategic flexibility, and tactical assessments of specific concrete conditions. But since doing the latter is far more difficult and more challenging, and since doing the former is oftentimes much easier and comes with the added benefit of invoking a sense of self-satisfied ideological purity, many on the left will opt for the easier, purer path every damn time. It's our job, as Lenin shows us, to combat the strain of ultra-leftism, which, although it dresses itself up in the rhetoric of Marxism, is, in the final analysis, deeply dogmatic and unscientific to the core. Alyson?
Awesome. So Lenin goes ahead then and continues his really concrete analysis of socialist strategy and the need to avoid this sort of dogmatism by trying to answer another question, which is, should we participate in bourgeois parliaments? Lenin is here arguing against certain positions among the German left communists who argue that parliamentary struggle is now, quote, politically obsolete. And Lenin affirms that in a sense this is true. Propagandistically and rhetorically speaking, parliamentary struggle is obsolete, Lenin says. The bourgeois parliaments are no longer the place where the decisions that will affect the future of the world are being made. That is happening in the party. But Lenin says practically, and in more concrete terms, it is absolutely absurd to say that this type of struggle is politically obsolete, because there are still workers who are invested in it and participate within it, which means that for the class itself, it clearly still has some level of relevance. Lenin explains, quote, even if only a fairly large minority of the industrial workers, and not millions and legions, followed the lead of the Catholic clergy, and a smaller similar minority of rural workers followed the landowners and kulaks, it undoubtedly signifies that parliamentarianism in Germany has not yet politically outlived itself, that participation in parliamentary elections and in the struggle on the parliamentary rostrum is obligatory on the party of the revolutionary proletariat, specifically for the purpose of educating the backward strata of its own class, and for the purpose of awakening and enlightening the undeveloped, downtrodden, and ignorant rural masses. Whilst you lack the strength to do away with bourgeois parliaments and every other type of reactionary institution, you must work within them because it is there, and you will still find workers who are duped by the priests and stupefied by the conditions of rural life. Otherwise, you risk turning into nothing but windbags, end quote. So again, what Lenin is pointing out is that we can't take a dogmatic stance towards parliaments. We can't just throw out the idea of participating in them completely, because some of the working class is still participating in them, and that part of the class needs to be reached as well. And so a strategic assessment of what that participation means is important. This doesn't mean that Lenin is under the assumption that we can get rid of capitalism through parliaments or through reforming capitalism through them. Rather, it is an important site where we can reach some aspects of the working class who otherwise might not be reached and pull them into a revolutionary struggle against that bourgeois parliament itself. Lenin again notes that the Bolsheviks did indeed participate in a boycott of the Constituent Assembly at various points, but that boycotts were actually the exception to the rule, and in most instances, the Bolsheviks participated in the parliamentary assemblies that were available to them. He argues that it's wrong to construe the Bolsheviks as a party which only pursued illegal struggle, and it ignores all of the work that they did within parliamentary institutions. Again, Lenin argues that participation in parliaments can show their limits and demonstrate how worthless they are, while also pitting the ruling class against itself. He writes, quote, the conclusion which follows from this is absolutely incontrovertible. It has been proved that, far from causing harm to the revolutionary proletariat, participation in bourgeois democratic parliament, even a few weeks before the victory of the Soviet Republic, and even after such a victory, actually helps the proletariat to prove to the backward masses why such parliaments deserve to be done away with. It facilitates their successful dissolution, and helps to make bourgeois parliamentarianism politically obsolete. To ignore this experience while at the same time claiming affiliation to the Communist International, which must work out its tactics internationally, not as narrow or exclusive national tactics, but as international tactics, means committing a gross error and actually abandoning internationalism in deed while recognizing it in words. So Lenin then argues that parliamentary participation tests the capacity of the party, and that if the party can't handle the difficulty of that participation, then it's kind of absurd to think they can handle the difficulty of revolution in the first place. Lenin also argues that it tests the leadership of the party and allows them to develop better skills and strategy. For Lenin, participation in bourgeois parliaments is not because they are an actual method of change. And in fact, he says making demands on these parliaments and making bourgeois politicians give you certain promises they're guaranteed to fail can go further to show why that parliament is obsolete. And therefore, our participation in it isn't to prop it up, but actually to constantly undermine it and show its limits to the workers who still believe in it. So finally, Lenin turns to the discussion of compromises in general, and the problems with a dogmatic and unflinching refusal to compromise in all conditions. And this is really a theme that Lenin keeps hitting on again and again. Lenin argues that it's really important that we learn to distinguish between those compromises which are created by objective material conditions, which we can do nothing about, and those compromises that are meant to allow capitalist restoration or right-wing opportunism to take a place within the party. Lenin argues that, for young revolutionaries, it makes sense that this is difficult to delineate between, but for those who have participated in class struggle, they can know the difference between them fairly reasonably. Lenin says, quote, "Every proletarian who has been through strikes and experienced compromises with the hated oppressors and exploiters, when the workers have had to return to work, either without having achieved anything, or else agreeing only to a partial satisfaction of their demands, can tell the difference. Every proletarian, as a result of the conditions of the mass struggle and the acute intensification of the class antagonism he lives among, sees the difference between a compromise enforced by objective conditions, such as a lack of strike funds, no outside support, starvation, and exhaustion, and on the other hand, a compromise by traitors who try to ascribe the objective causes to their self-interest, strike breakers who also enter into compromises, and their cowardice and desire to toady the capitalist class, and readiness to yield to intimidation, sometimes to persuasion, sometimes to sops, and sometimes to flattery from the capitalists." End quote. So again, what's crucial for Lenin here is that there is a difference that you can only learn through engaging in mass struggle between those compromises or retreats that are really forced on you, in which compromising or retreating might be the difference between your organization living another day or getting totally crushed in a given struggle, and compromises which are clearly motivated by right-wing opportunism and liberalism. And it is important for experienced revolutionaries to reflect on their experiences in strikes and various other forms of actions in order to develop that differentiation. Lenin insists that a non-dogmatic assessment of the dividing lines in a given moment is crucial. There's no singular heuristic which can determine the correct course at a given time, and that can show a difference between opportunist compromises and necessary compromises. Only a real investigation into the specific moment can yield that realization, and that comes from experience and a long-time pursuit of tactics and strategy. Lenin further argues that compromises in general are necessary to weaken the capitalist class by exposing internal rifts and playing them against each other, because they have a level of international strength and coordination which we cannot match. And here Lenin's point is interesting. The bourgeoisie are a global force, and when they begin to get weakened in one country, they can draw an external support in order to push back. And so for Lenin, when we make strategic compromises with the bourgeoisie, it should be to pit them against each other, siding perhaps with one bourgeois politician over another, so that those two politicians end up at each other's throat and actually end up weakening their own coherence. This is the kind of undermining participation that Lenin says is important. It's a compromise with real strategic goals for the movement, which keeps revolution in mind and always works towards the destruction of the bourgeoisie on the whole, not actually extending their life. Lenin looks to specific instances in the context of British socialist politics in particular in order to argue that strategic support for various bourgeois politicians in certain contexts ought to be meant to win specific victories and to undermine their status with the masses, such that when we say that we support a bourgeois politician, it is in, quote, the same way as a rope supports a hanged man, end quote. What is crucial here, then, is that we do not put our faith in Parliament or in these compromises themselves as revolutionary acts, but we rather understand them in the context of a broader revolutionary theory. We have to move beyond dogmatism and invariable insistence on principles that can never adapt to the real given moment. Marxism is a scientific approach to revolution, and it therefore has to be adaptive, and you can't simply weigh out the possibility of compromising with aspects of Parliament or compromising with aspects of trade unions if those compromises are what's necessary for the revolutionary movement to continue. In the end, Lenin's emphasis is that we cannot preclude any terrain of struggle on the basis of dogma or ultra-leftism, but we must engage in the spaces that the masses already exist in. Unions and Parliament are an example of this. This does not mean that we assume that the bourgeois Parliament can be used to move beyond capitalism, but rather we understand that participation within Parliament as a means of demonstrating the limits of Parliament itself. What is crucial at the end of this text for Lenin is that we move beyond an infantile ultra-leftism, which insists on always going with the uncompromising dogmatic path, and that we make actual scientifically informed choices that further the struggle. And that is what frames Lenin's discussion of centralization, of discipline, of working with trade unions, of working with Parliament, and of having a leadership class within the vanguard itself. What it comes down to is a practicality that is grounded in scientific assessment and rules nothing out so long as what is being done furthers the cause of proletarian revolution.
Incredibly well said. I really, really enjoyed this text. It was really fun to dive into this sort of underappreciated text that Lenin wrote. But now that we've explained and summarized the main arguments of that text, we're going to go into section 2, where we reflect on and discuss some of the key points and ideas in this text. And I'll start off with the first question, Alyson. So, throughout this curriculum, Red Menace, we're reaching the end of our time with Lenin on the show. As we aim to move on to other theorists in the coming months, then eventually our plan is to go back and visit Marx and Engels' original texts with all the stuff we've learned thus far in mind, sort of explore the contradictions and tensions and agreements between those theories. So as we wrap up, I wanted to ensure people have a good grasp of some key terms that Lenin uses in this text and many others. Namely, the three terms I'm worried about are opportunism, social chauvinism, and what actually he means by left-wing communism. I know we've covered a lot of this stuff, and I think most people have a fairly good general grasp on these terms and their meanings. But just to ensure that as we're leaving Lenin, can you please explain or define these three terms as succinctly as you can, and then maybe give us some modern-day examples of each so we can really flesh out our understanding?
Definitely. So in terms of opportunism, basically I would define opportunism as the tendency for right-wing and pro-capitalist elements to emerge within the socialist movement, and those elements usually use Marxist rhetoric itself in order to push back against revolution, to abandon class struggle, or in post-revolutionary context to allow for capitalist restoration. So when Lenin talks about opportunism, he's talking specifically about those figures within the socialist movement who then move in a rightward direction and actually begin to abandon the core class struggle of Marxism itself. So one example for that we could look at would be Lenin's criticism of Kowski in State and Revolution, where he says that he ultimately moves in this kind of reformist, pro-bourgeois state direction that abandons the crucial insight of Marxism, which is the necessity of establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat. And so that would be one sort of historical example of opportunism. In terms of more contemporary examples, I'm just going to name names if that's okay.
Let's go!
The best example that I can think of would be sort of the right wing of the DSA. So the Bread and Roses caucus, in many ways, I think represents this. And they use Marxist language of class struggle to justify what is essentially spending tens of thousands of dollars of their organizational money towards funding an unaccountable Democratic candidate instead of building an independent socialist party. Now, we can debate about the merits of parliamentarian strategy in the US at all, but we should be clear that when Lenin talks about the need to participate in parliament, he's talking about running our own people who are accountable to our parties in it. And what we see being used by the right wing of the DSA is Marxist language to justify something completely different, which is giving a capitalist bourgeois party unconditional support and funding, and then pretending that that is a part of Marxist revolution. So that would be, I think, the more concrete and contemporary example of opportunism within the socialist movement in the United States. The other one would be social chauvinism. So opportunism within international socialism often takes the form of social chauvinism, and this usually includes siding with imperialist bourgeoisie, support for imperialist wars, denial of autonomy for colonized nations, appeals to patriotism in the imperial core. These are all kind of examples of social chauvinist positions. Lenin originally used the term to refer to those within the German communist movement who backed war bonds and ended up supporting the imperialist aggression of World War I. So social chauvinism has this more imperialist component to it. And leftists who support imperialism and take a chauvinist stance still exist today and uphold this trend, whether that's through those who, subtly defend U.S. interference in Syria by defending the relationship between the U.S. and the Kurds and making that relationship completely beyond critique, or those who denounce the right for global South countries to self-determine in the first place. All of these people within the left still engage in a form of social chauvinism that tacitly sides with and supports imperialist politics while justifying it through revolutionary and Marxist language. So then finally, left-wing communism. So this is now, since Lenin has written this book, a much larger and more evolved tendency. But left-wing communism within Marxism usually distinguishes itself from both Marxist-Leninist factions and from reformist social democratic factions within the left. Left communism usually denounces electoralism and also trade unionism and also national liberation. So left communists will argue that only revolution is important, parliamentarian strategy has no place, that the unions are too reactionary, and that revolution has to be international without national bounds, and that because of this, national liberation is always a reactionary project. This ultra-left variant of Marxism is usually known for dogmatic defense of Marx's original ideas, frequently arguing that Lenin and Stalin in fact corrupted them in some way. A notable exception to this are the left communist followers of Bordiga, who actually claim that they uphold Lenin's thought and try to read what they see as a non-Stalinist interpretation of Lenin. So left communism is broad as it exists today, and there's many currents within it that disagree, but those are kind of some basic agreeing principles that we see within left-wing communism. Today, this group is largely found in academic Marxist circles because such a staunch insistence on a pure Marxism, just as Lenin points out, is really not super well suited for the actual messiness that class struggle and working with the masses involves. And so it's a lot easier for it to stay in the abstract or hypothetical realm. But organizations do still exist today on the left which uphold left-wing communism. For example, the organizations associated with the Journal Intransigence are part of a national and international formation that takes a stance of anti-feminism, anti-national liberation, anti-electoralism, anti-trade unionist politics on the idea that these are all corruptions of Marxism, and that we need to protect a pure Marxism, which actually gets back to the roots. So these people still exist, but that's kind of what those terms mean and how they play out in our current situation.
Yeah, I was kind of interested to find just how entrenched this idea that national liberation is a bad thing is on the left comm side of things. One helpful sort of device that I tweeted about recently to help people who might be confused on this topic better understand is if you understand the difference between black and brown pride versus white pride, then you should understand the difference between reactionary nationalism and national liberation struggles. And it's often national liberation struggles that are the very thing that sort of clears the way for a more robust socialist project. You have to get out from underneath the yoke of imperialist capitalist masters in order to, in a neo-colonial context or a colonial context in order to build a socialist movement. And then also, when we're talking about the sort of social chauvinism and the orientation it takes towards imperialism, it's not, and I think you hinted at this quite well, Alyson, it's not just explicit support for one's own country versus other. It often, and almost always these days, takes actually way more insidious and subtle ways. One thing you notice a lot on the left with regards to Venezuela, for instance, is when that situation first started developing, a lot of non-Leninists, non-Marxists especially, they would begin to just use this as an opportunity to air their disdain or their grievances or their nuanced sort of criticisms of Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution. And in a time when those people are under existential attack, that sort of impulse is also sort of reactionary in the way that we're talking here. It's social chauvinist in a more subtle but just as damaging way. And then finally, I'll just toss a question back because we often hear the word revisionism on the left today. What is the difference between opportunism and revisionism? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or are they pretty much synonyms? How do you think about those two words?
Yeah, so I think they have similarity and they have overlap. I mean, one comrade recently on Twitter, I think, gave a very succinct definition of revisionism that I like, which it's the abandoning of the class struggle component within socialism is how they defined it. So that is obviously a type of opportunism, but it also refers to something more specific, I think, which is a gutting of, that revolutionary core itself, in which Marxism becomes kind of an abstracted progression of history and the struggle, the real concrete movement of the masses, and the fact that is an oppositional form of movement really gets gutted and left behind. And so I would say that's what revisionism, at least as I use it, refers to, and I think it's more specific than opportunism on the whole.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's completely correct. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, no worries. So my question is, in What is to be Done, Lenin argues that freedom of criticism and anti-dogmatism can be rhetorical techniques that right opportunists actually use to question revolutionary trajectories within socialism. But in this text, we kind of see Lenin adopt a different stance, where he actually takes a more anti-dogmatic stance and endorses a sort of criticism of dogmatism, especially against left communists. So how does Lenin determine when these rhetorical approaches are operating in good faith and when they're a Trojan horse for opportunism? How do we recognize that distinction?
Okay, yeah, great question. Kind of difficult. I think it boils down to like the actual effect of these rhetorical approaches, right? Like regardless of the intentions on the part of whoever is pushing them. It's sort of like what Stalin said in our last text regarding imperialism. It doesn't matter what someone says their position is or even what they intend their behavior to promote. What matters is the actual effect. So if the effect of a certain set of actions materially helps or is neutral to the propagation of imperialism, it must be combated. If the effect of a certain set of actions materially hinders or weakens imperialism, it must be supported, right? So in the same way, we must ask, what is the effect of insisting on freedom of criticism and anti-dogmatism in this specific context? And what is the effect of insisting on freedom of criticism and anti-dogmatism in a totally different context? That essential nuance is present like everywhere in this work specifically, and it's why Lenin rails against the dogmatic assertion of abstract principles which don't or can't take into account the constantly shifting conditions that one is operating in. So when it comes to compromises, the German left communists would yell never, right? Never compromises any circumstances. It's a general principle we hold. Lenin scoffs and asks us what the context is and how certain compromises might advance the struggle or how at times tactical retreats are necessary and can even strengthen a movement long term. When it comes to engaging in parliaments, the left communists would scream never. Lenin scoffs again, right? And asks us to think more deeply about different scenarios. He says we need to put reality ahead of our desires and engage in these things tactically depending on an array of considerations in a given place at a given time. Lenin never takes an abstract principle and places it in front of a sober materialist analysis of the concrete situation. Like this enrages like utopians and idealists of all stripes as they cling to their abstractions and their smug sense of superiority. But it's precisely this flexibility, this tactical analysis, and this prioritizing of material conditions over abstract ideological principles that Lenin not only argues for, but puts on full display in this work, which answers this question. In What is to be Done, Lenin shows clearly how this urgent call for freedom of criticism and anti-dogmatism in the specific context of the party at that time had the actual concrete effect of sneaking in bourgeois bullshit and weakening the party in a real qualitative way. It confused and created directionless and aimlessness in the party. In that case, it really was a Trojan horse, even if some of the individuals spouting those lines were 100% sincere. But in this case, Lenin's freedom of criticism and anti-dogmatism served to clarify and demystify, and thus strengthen the movement and the party. So I really think it's at the end of the day, it's about this effect, and it's about taking context and conditions into consideration when you're dealing with any, abstract concept or principle. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I think that you do have to look at the specificity. And yeah, I think that's really like what it makes sense coming from this text where Lenin's emphasis is that you have to move away from pure abstraction and principle to a specific moment. And so understanding that sometimes that's a Trojan horse and sometimes it's not has to be determined by a concrete analysis of what, material force is playing within the party, I think is absolutely right. So I think your answer to this also is very in line with how Lenin is kind of framing the entire question within the book.
Right. And I would just add also the intention does matter insofar as it matters how you deal with that person, right? If they're pushing this stuff out of naivete, then a struggle, then a sort of education is way more of an appropriate path to take than expulsion. But if they are doing it cynically and consciously, if they are, a sort of conscious agent of the bourgeoisie and they're bringing these things in specifically to weaken the party, then it's just, expulsion at that point. So on that level, intention does matter. But at the end of the day, it's really the effect that we should be focusing on with regards to these, abstract principles.
Totally. And I think Lenin in this text also, in some of the historical specifics, is very attentive to that intention too. Because even when he talks about the Bolsheviks purging its left-wing elements, he says, and then later on, many of them rejoined the party. And he talks about Bukharin as an example of someone who acknowledged he was wrong for that kind of ultra-leftism and was brought back in because that intention had been sincere, and even though that had led to isolation and being pushed out, eventually when that mistake was rectified, there was room for reintegration into the party. And he says many of the left communists within the Bolsheviks went on to be really good members of the Communist Party eventually, but they had to recognize that they were incorrect first.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so next question. All right, so I sometimes think that, given the specific nature of the left here in the imperial core and the dominance of various petty bourgeois, social democratic, and crypto-individualist strains of radicalism that exist here, and given that climate change is coming very soon and in some ways is already very much here, that instead of a Bolshevik-style party and revolution, we are more than likely facing a much more diffuse, somewhat balkanized future, where our Marxist movements will become more like FARC or the IRA or the Naxalites than the Bolsheviks or the Cubans. So what are your thoughts on the likelihood of that specific future, and how would the lessons of Lenin in this text still apply in that less than ideal context?
Sure. So on the kind of likelihood question, this is the thing in the US, right? Is that, where we're at with climate change especially, it looks like that is going to have a huge influence on revolutionary struggle. So I'm also sympathetic to this idea that maybe this more guerrilla-style form of resistance is actually where we're going to head. If climate change continues to occur at the rate that it's occurring and capitalism doesn't slow it down in some way, that means that in the next 50 years we could be looking at some amount of social collapse within the United States in terms of civil society that would create these spaces for that type of resistance to exist really well. Currently in the US, I would say that civil society is stable enough that that sort of strategy would be difficult to pull off, but as parts of the country become unlivable, as very likely the rich retreat to more geographically ideal places and leave the rest of the country in more or less desperate ruins trying to survive this, room for that kind of resistance could exist. So I really do think that that is a potential future that we're going to see within the United States, and I do think that that sort of balkanization is actually possible here, as various groups, not just the left, would probably try to take advantage of that sort of decay of civil society. Whether or not that's for sure guaranteed, who knows, right? It all depends on the course that several things take and how the bourgeois state responds to climate change. But currently, it's not looking like it's going to respond very well, so certainly there's reasons to suspect that that is the direction things will go in. Regardless, I think what's important is whether we're going in that direction or something that would look more like the Bolsheviks, the important thing is that we continue to pursue the same strategy now. That doesn't change the fact that we need a party, that we need discipline, that we need to struggle on every terrain in which struggle is possible. Lenin's insight still makes sense there, even if we're going to be moving in a direction where some level of civil society collapse occurs, because up to that point, we need to build strength and build rapport among the masses, so that when things reach that more desperate moment, we actually have a way of surviving it. So I think that actually the ideas that we get from Lenin in this text and his other texts are still really eminently applicable to us right now, even if we're moving in that direction, because they can help us accumulate and gather the kind of strength that we need moving into that situation to be able to survive a more protracted sort of resistance that would look like those other groups. So that's my thought on the situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think, like I mentioned the IRA, and I did that for a specific reason, because what the IRA did very well, I think, is combined this sort of illegal and legal structure into their resistance to British imperialism. Sinn Féin is a sort of above-ground political party, but at the height of the IRA, it was also sort of, the above-ground face of a also underground movement. And in the face of climate chaos and other forms of instability and crisis, the bourgeois state will become more repressive. And in that context, I think we're going to have to continually look to stuff like the IRA and other Marxist guerrilla movements as sort of a path forward as far as to navigate some of these specific circumstances. And I also do believe that it will require, if that is our future, it will require sort of principled coalitions with other tendencies on the left. In lieu of capturing a state apparatus or something, some of our big difficulties and differences between different tendencies, it gets diminished a little bit. And in the context of literally fighting for our lives and in a sort of future dystopia, I think like working across tendencies becomes even more important. And I don't think anything Lenin says in this text or any other really takes that off the board. Do you?
No, I don't think it necessarily does. I mean, I think Lenin, is recognizing that we have to work with people who don't have what we think is necessarily the perfect theory. And part of that is that we might even change their mind through working with them. If our theory really is actionable and scientifically grounded, that should be obvious to those who we're entering in coalition with. But if anything, I think this text opens the possibility for that form of coalition work as a site where struggle still continues. So, you have your differences and you don't paper over them. And by not papering over them, but working together anyway, you can actually still engage in a form of ideological struggle that could maybe even bring people to your side, I think, if your ideas really are proving that they are applicable and that they work in practice.
Yeah, I actually do think that. I think about this a lot. I think that, we're sort of in this this period of time where a bunch of different little leftist sects and tendencies and orgs and cadres are popping up everywhere. But as things move on and as the left in this country and on this continent becomes more mature, I think we will be moving towards that situation where, maybe one or two movements or organizations really start to advance and set themselves apart from the pack. And in that context, I think that will force the hand of a lot of people who can, sort of have the luxury of being hypersectarians at this moment in time, but won't have that luxury in the future. And when one movement really begins to gain steam, begins to gain some level of mass support, and can show that it's able to organize and defend itself in the context of climate chaos and instability, I think that will set, things aside and make very clear what theory is guiding the right sort of action and which theories are leading to dead ends. And that could be a clarifying process.
Definitely. I mean, it'll definitely make it very clear in stark terms, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So then the next question that I had for you is, Lenin is really optimistic in this text and argues that socialist victory is increasingly likely. He frames his argument specifically through this idea. In the conclusion of the text, he says, the proletariat vanguard has been ideologically won over. That is the main thing. Without it, not even the first step towards victory can be made. Is this still the case for the situation we're operating in? And if not, how does this affect the applicability of Lenin's takeaway in this text? For us in the US, have the proletariat been ideologically won over in that way? That's kind of my open question.
Yeah. So Lenin says right before that, quote, the vanguard of the working class movement has been won over in that it has ranged itself on the side of the Soviet power against parliamentarianism, on the side of the dictatorship of the proletariat against bourgeois democracy. So if that is what he means by winning the vanguard over, then no. Not only have they not been won over, the left in the U.S. is in a sort of abysmal state of confusion. The biggest podcast on the U.S. left by far is Chapo Trap House, right? And they routinely make clear that engaging in electoralism is the only way forward. To their left are countless radicals of countless stripes, the majority of which, it sometimes seems, are more content arguing on social media with other leftists than building anything concrete and meaningful. Moreover, we are still operating in a sort of Occupy mindset, where tailing social movements, endless street protests, and crippling horizontalist dogma still rule the day. Those of us interested in building a properly revolutionary party in the Leninist sense are in the minority on the North American left. And this is not an accident, by the way, right? It's the product of a centuries-long anti-communist indoctrination campaign. I mean, the capitalist state here would prefer 100 Occupy protests to one Black Panther Party or Bolshevik Party, and they know that. So we have a lot to overcome that places like Russia in Lenin's time didn't necessarily have to, with regards to that sort of ideological bludgeoning and that anti-communism that's been inculcated in the population. We are, if we must force an analogy here, closer to where Russia was in the middle and late 1800s with regards to leftist political thought and organization. And in fact, later in that chapter, Lenin says, quote, in order for the whole class and the broad masses to take up a position of some degree of support for a vanguard, propaganda and agitation alone are not enough. For this, the masses must have their own political experience. Such is the fundamental law of all great revolutions. The masses of Russia and Germany had to realize through their own painful experience the absolute impotence and spinelessness, the absolute helplessness and servility to the bourgeoisie, and the absolute inevitability of a dictatorship of extreme reaction as the only alternative to a dictatorship of the proletariat in order to turn them resolutely toward communism, end quote. So if he's correct in this, even if we had a coherent and organized vanguard, which I don't think we do, then it seems that only extreme crisis and instability will allow the vast majority of fairly passive and contented North Americans to really become convinced to abandon their deeply inculcated sense that capitalism is natural and inevitable, and that all other symptoms are pretty much synonymous with brutality, repression, and tyranny. So it is horrifying to me that this seems to be necessary, and I am certainly no accelerationist. But I genuinely can't imagine anything other than the stripping away of people's comfort and privilege in the imperial core and the dramatic decrease in the average quality of life here to be the catalyst to significant sections of the masses embracing and joining our movement. And capital will try everything it possibly can to prevent that from happening, ranging from policies like the UBI to interactive technologies that offer people an escape from reality to, in the final analysis, brute repression of leftist leaders and movements. But having said that, it's still utterly incumbent upon all of us to organize right now, to lay the foundations now for what may come in the future. We have to be ready to embrace people and plug them into our organizations if and when the time comes where they start looking for alternatives. So this is not a howl of empty pessimism on my part. It's a reminder that we are entering very difficult times, and we have to be as prepared and organized as possible, as quickly as possible, if we hope to navigate and survive the dystopia that we're being ushered into daily. So I guess that's sort of my take. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that you're correct, that to some extent, just the comforts that being in the imperial core have provided to people have to slip away, but I want to emphasize that I do think they are. I think we're reaching really new levels of crises within capitalism. I mean, I was looking at a report today that now the majority of Americans skip healthcare because they can't afford it, and that sort of thing, the increasing cost of drugs that people need to stay alive, is going to have really concrete quality of life effects, like seeing a decreasing life expectancy in the United States is probably going to be the likely result of that, as people avoid things like preventative care because capitalism has just totally made it out of reach for them. So even though capitalism, I agree, uses things like a UBI to try to stabilize, also private forces have a level of anarchy in their operation and how they work on the market that I think in terms of medicine and food and housing access is really creating a level of misery now that we haven't seen before, and that is starting, I think, a little bit to wake people up to some of the limits. Unfortunately, it might not be enough, but I do think that some of those crises are really intensifying right now.
Yeah, and I also wonder too, like, if some social democrat like Bernie Sanders that promises, gains in like healthcare and stuff like that, which I think the majority of Americans totally believe that healthcare needs to be way more affordable, etc. If he gets in, and he's elected with all the hopes, of so many people that he's really going to change things for working class people. And then he runs headfirst into the obstruction machine that is U.S. Congress and the Republican Party. I mean, look what they did to Obama. And he was the most bland neoliberal centrist you could imagine, who tried to capitulate every way he could to the right and tried to win them over to no avail. They still thought he was a Kenyan Marxist communist infiltrator, right? So imagine a Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish, by the way, which plays into far right-wing biases and racism. Mm-hmm. Imagine him trying to go up against that grinding slaughterhouse of obstruction and, stoppage. I don't think that he's going to be able to achieve what he wants to. And in face of that sort of almost inevitable failure of social democracy, then what will the reaction of the masses be? Some people will certainly turn further leftwards and realize that this is not an effective way to move forward in our society. But some people will just sort of be bounced right back into like, what we need is a right-wing figure who can actually get stuff done, or what we need is a return to the center after Trump and Bernie, and maybe that's the way to go. And so that level of confusion, I think, is going to play out in really interesting and complex ways going forward. So there's little hints of what might be opportunities for us, but there's also a lot of reason to think that it's just not going to come fast enough and in the way that we want,
Sure. Yeah, I think the Bernie thing is an interesting thought, too, because I think, if he does get elected and hits those walls, that will kind of create a crisis for social democracy in a certain way. And it's interesting to me that the people who support socialist resources being behind Bernie never point to that as an example of why we should support him, right? Because that seems like the kind of example that Lenin's pointing to for support that is as a noose to a hangman, right? Recognizing that failure is coming, and that would create a crisis. And it would be interesting if you heard more of the electoralists in the U.S. socialist movement talk about Bernie that way, instead of kind of this naive belief that he actually is going to accomplish all of those things.
Yeah, and one thing that even Bernie himself says, which a lot of his supporters don't seem to really focus on, is like he's made it pretty clear, even though he uses really weird language like all social democrats do, of the need for, a political revolution alongside his election. And that, so at the end of the day, all this energy and time going into just supporting one candidate is actually going to be useless if you're also not doing that crucial organizing work that can actually put pressure on the system to help whatever reforms Bernie wants to get through. Because in lieu of that groundswell of mass support behind a social democratic movement, that social democratic movement is bound to share the same fate that Obama did. And in this two-party system where we just bounce back and forth between center-left and center-right candidates, it's just going to be deconstructed by whatever right-wing weirdo comes after Bernie. So they don't take that seriously enough, even though Bernie himself has pretty much said that it's going to be an essential part of his success or failure going forward.
Right. Definitely.
All right, so I think that ends Section 2, and now we are going to move on to Section 3, the application of theory.
Okay, so now for part 3, we are going to look at the applicability of this text today. So in our third section, we try to apply it to our struggles and our organization and our strategic considerations that we in the socialist movement have to face now. And so I'm interested in talking about this idea of parliamentary participation. I tend to fall down maybe on the more ultra-left side of this question, but I think that if we take Lenin seriously, we really need to analyze the utility of participation in the context of the United States. Lenin calls for parliamentarianism is based on the idea that the working class and the masses are already invested in parliamentarianism. He explicitly says the reason that participation is obligatory is because you'll still find a minority of the working class there. And as long as that large minority is there, we have to work within it. Well, this may have been historically true in many of the bourgeois republics at the time that Lenin wrote this text. I want to try to argue that this might not necessarily be true in the United States. Lenin does not demand a dogmatic support for parliamentarism. He demands a strategic assessment and a choice to follow the conclusions of that assessment regardless of dogma. And so in light of that, I want to assess our situation non-dogmatically in order to determine what is strategic for building the socialist movement in the US right now. I think that it would be faulty to read this text as a demand that parliamentary action is correct at all times. It is rather a claim that strategic non-dogmatic assessments are crucial. So let's do such an assessment. It's worth recognizing that in the United States, on the national level, the percentage of those who turn out to vote in a given election actually fluctuates, with highs generally being around 60% and lows being around 40%. And in 2018, 156 million citizens were registered to vote in the first place out of a population of 327 million. So this means that roughly 47% of the population in the United States are registered to vote in the first place. And of that 40%, only 60% turned out to actually vote. This makes it clear, in my opinion, that the average person living in the United States sees elections as really not a central part of their political life. In fact, it indicates to me that elections are so insignificant for a vast majority of Americans that they do not even bother to take a single day to participate in them. I think that turnout is a really interesting metric because it's a very low level of required interaction with the political system, but we see it being so low. Now, of course, this would not be sufficient grounds for dismissing electoral strategy on the whole, but it allows us to frame the issue in the context of the United States. Now, of course, I also want to point out that many socialists who cite Lenin in support of electoral strategy favor focusing on local elections over national elections. So we have to look also at what participation in local parliamentary work looks like in comparison with national work. And the problem is that when we look to local elections, we actually see even worse participation. In 2014, researchers at the University of Wisconsin did a comprehensive study that tracked voter turnout in local elections among 144 large U.S. cities, and found that there was overall decline in participation among local elections from previous years, with national averages for turnout over a long term hovering around 21% of registered voters. So again, that's 21% of the 46% of the populace that even is registered to vote in the first place. This indicates that local elections really are even a less relevant site of struggle for the majority of people living in the United States. Now, of course, it's not enough to note that most people living in the United States do not vote. We have to consider whether or not elections are central for the working class and for the oppressed masses, not just the majority of people. But the data on these points actually only further emphasizes the irrelevance of electoral struggle for most oppressed people in the United States. According to Pew Research, quote, nearly half half of non-voters, 46%, have family incomes less than $30,000, compared with 19% of likely voters. Most non-voters, 54%, have not attended college. 72% of likely voters have completed at least some college, end quote. This indicates that the poor and working classes are in fact less likely to engage in elections than more wealthy and petty bourgeois individuals are likely to. As such, we might conclude that, for those parts of the masses most central to truly proletarian struggle, elections remain a mostly insignificant aspect of life. Furthermore, Pew researchers found that voter participation is racialized as well, with 43% of non-voters being Black or Latino compared to 22% of voters. This is not purely because of a lack of interest, though. A long and ongoing history of voter disenfranchisement in the United States exists today, and this makes sure that working people of color in particular cannot access elections in the first place because of deregistration, identification requirements, and other bureaucratic loopholes designed to disenfranchise the most marginalized among the working class. As such, I think that we really do need to question whether an electoral strategy is even accessible to many workers in the United States in the first place, given that the colonial U.S. government has done its best to exclude them from official participation at all. Lenin says if there is a large minority of workers who are invested in parliamentarianism, then we still need to be involved in it. But I don't think that that large minority is obvious in the context of the United States. There's several reasons for this, but really it's because when it comes down to it, those who do vote and interact with the election system for a single day are mostly rich and mostly white. And when we look at the working class, they mostly have decided to ignore this form of struggle. When you talk to workers among the working poor, you often hear a skepticism towards politics and a recognition that no one within Congress actually represents the working people in this country. And this isn't surprising. In this instance, I think there is a higher level of consciousness among the most marginalized of the masses that people give credit for. So given these realities, I think that it's obvious that elections are almost, irrelevant in the lives of the working class and oppressed masses today in the United States. If these numbers actually showed participation, then we would absolutely have to consider the relevancy of an electoral struggle. But given that the vast, vast majority of working and oppressed people don't turn out for a single day to vote, it seems silly to assume that elections are a magical bridge by which we can connect the working class and a revolutionary movement and strategic goals. Now, I want to say that I think Lenin is much more correct about unions in this instance, since they have the opportunity to really interact with workers in their daily lives at work through workplace organizing. But Lenin's thoughts on parliamentary strategy, in my opinion, do not cleanly map onto the reality of how the working class feels about Congress and the Senate within the U.S. Another relevant concern, and one that I think gets brushed over a lot when we try to apply this text to the context of the U.S., is that the U.S. doesn't have a parliament. Congress and Senate actually function different than a parliament proper. In a proper parliament, you usually have many parties which then form a coalition to create a majority government or a minority government, and this allows smaller parties to participate and run more radical candidates who then form parliamentary coalitions. Even in the context when Lenin talks about the use of participating in European parliaments, he talks about forming these kind of coalitions with bourgeois parties when it is necessary. But in the US, this is just simply not how the legislative branch works. There are two parties who absolutely dominate it, the Democrats and the Republicans, and those who call themselves socialists have only been able to get into Congress and the Senate through running as Democrats within one of the bourgeois parties. I think given this reality, if we want to apply this text today, we have to ask that with the unique two-party structure of the US, is it actually concretely possible for us to even get into Congress and Senate without immediately turning to opportunism and supporting bourgeois politics of the Democratic Party? And if it's not possible, we have to ask whether the concrete requirements of working within the Democratic Party outweigh the benefits of parliamentary participation in the first place. I think this is an open question that needs to be debated, and I'm glad to see members of various socialist groups within the US starting to truly debate what the path forward is. But my point is that this text in particular cannot be dogmatically used to claim that participation in Congress and Senate is necessary in the US. We instead, as Lenin always reminds us, have to reject dogma, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, and focus on a concrete assessment of our actual situation and determine what is strategic here. And my hope is that I've at least given some real data that we can chew on when we're making that assessment.
Yeah, so you said when you started that you feel like you might have a little bit more of an ultra-leftist position on this topic than Lenin might. But I actually think that Lenin would probably agree with you in the context of the U.S. specifically, given everything you just laid out, because it is so conditional and is so dependent on the conditions and context that people are operating in. But I do have a question for you. This is sort of devil's advocate, but this is something that I hear a lot. And this is something that everybody from the PSL to like Matt on Chapo Trap House will often talk about, which is this idea that it's not so much about winning, right? Because I agree with you that once you win and get sucked into the system, especially in this two-party system, like it will almost, like, what can you do other than be an opportunist at that point? But their argument would be like, elections and campaigns specifically are a place where you can get your ideas out, since, electoralism, for better or worse, is like the primary arena where most politically active people like exist and operate in. And, if we're thinking about a war of position, then one thing that campaigns do allow is for the sort of imagination to be expanded. The window of like acceptable policy proposals can get shifted. And I think we've seen that with stuff like healthcare, over the last couple of presidencies. There's really been this move leftward on that specific topic. So, not talking about getting elected into Congress, but just running campaigns like the PSL will run Gloria La Riva just to get their ideas out because of those facts. What are your thoughts on that general, just a part of a broader strategy, but still a part?
Yeah, so this is a conversation that I was having with a comrade within the Marxist Center recently, where their argument essentially was, well, it's not about winning, it's about sort of the coverage and the intention that a campaign can get you. And my response to them is, no disrespect to the PSL on this front, but walk into your average workplace and ask them if they've heard of Gloria La Riva. Yeah. And I think, quite frankly, the answer is going to be no. Those presidential campaigns that the PSL runs and that other parties run do get some attention. I was discussing this even with a PSL comrade who was saying, like, yeah, we got on Democracy Now! As a result of it, but we don't get mainstream press attention as a result of it. And I think that's true, because those campaigns actually have to be excluded from the mainstream bourgeois press because of the fact that they could be potentially useful. I think the fact that there isn't really a dissident press in the United States outside of the bourgeoisie makes that kind of strategy even harder, since the capitalist press can just choose to not give you a platform. And I think if you look towards the campaigns that the PSL has run or other far-left parties have run, you can see that this is the case. They actually did not garner that much media attention or national attention in the first place. Now, I'll concede that the more social democratic approaches to this, like running Bernie or AOC, have gotten policy discussions into the mainstream, like the Green New Deal or Medicare for All. But in those instances, I think those are non-revolutionary discussions that are about how we can use capitalism to save capitalism. So I don't know that they actually get anything in terms of bringing attention to the revolutionary necessity of socialism. Candidates like Gloria La Riva can talk about genuinely revolutionary strategies, but they get shut out of public discussions and public platforms. And it's only those who are willing to talk about reforms that can in fact act as band-aids to help capitalism who ever actually get coverage in the first place. So I don't think even the generating attention and generating a discussion thing works for truly revolutionary ideas in the electoral sphere. I think it's still really only more opportunist ideas that get given a platform at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I just wanted to see how you thought about that sort of position, because it is sort of popular on the broad left.
Totally.
All right, but I'm going to move on to my point. And for my section, I want to zoom out a bit from the details of this text and talk about how this text specifically and Lenin's work broadly represent the most strategic and tactical tendency on the left to this very day. For those who have followed me since the creation of Revolutionary Left Radio might know, I have been in a constant state of political development for a very long time, often evolving into new tendencies as my understanding and experience grow. Over the last decade or so, I've been a card-carrying democratic socialist. I've been a bitter sectarian anti-Leninist anarchist. As a quick aside, I even once made a pretty successful Facebook page after I had a little run-in with some MLs on a debate forum. The title of the page was Anarchism, Socialism, and Anti-Communism. So I cringe in retrospect, but at one point in my development, I was that guy. I've also been a libertarian Marxist. I've flirted with left communism, and then over the last few years specifically, I've been pulled increasingly toward the MLM side of things. I lump those two together because I view them in their best forms as both deeply Leninist tendencies, and although I have individual positions that may align more with MLs at times and more with MLMs at other times, I don't see them as intractably in opposition to one another as some do. But the point I want to make here is that as I went through my various stages of personal political development, and as I got more and more into actual organizing and education over the last few years specifically, my focus began to shift away from the question, what ideas or tendency do I personally find the most attractive, and towards questions of strategy. After all, in virtually all of the tendencies I mentioned, communism is the explicit end goal. It's what we all want. But the question that came to weigh increasingly heavy on my mind was not the what of communism, but the how. How do we actively and concretely move from our abysmal situation as disorganized leftists in North America toward our goal? How do we organize effectively in the here and now while building toward those goals? What movements in the past have gone the furthest in the struggle and why? Given the level of imperialist aggression towards any proletarian project, which movements have been able to defend themselves and continue their political project instead of being co-opted or crushed? Time and time again, those questions and the utterly insufficient answers that various tendencies propped up to those questions were the catalyst to me leaving behind whatever tendency I had adopted at that point, finding them to be sorely lacking on precisely this front, and pushed me inexorably towards Marxism. When I came into contact with robust and principled Maoism, I began seeing how effective Mao was and how deeply and clearly he thought about tactics and strategy. When I actually started studying proletarian history in earnest and actually reading Lenin directly, as opposed to mindlessly absorbing all the shallow, ahistorical, and clearly anti-communist stereotypes about him and the Bolsheviks, I found him to not only be exhilarating and very literary, but genuinely brilliant. I realized that to be a Leninist, whether ML or MLM, was simply to be a Marxist in the age of imperialism and proletarian revolution. All other forms of non-Leninist Marxism talked a big game, but often had nothing materially to show for themselves in terms of challenging global capitalism and imperialist hegemony, spreading revolution around the globe, and defending and exercising real proletarian power. And if we take Marxism-Leninism and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism together, they represent, over the last century, a vastly disproportionate amount of the successful or semi-successful proletarian movements. Even to this very day, as I sit here talking to you right now, Maoist revolutionaries are teaming up with the indigenous peoples in the Philippines to fight back against Duterte and the imperialist attempts to extract wealth and resources from indigenous lands. Other Maoists, namely the Naxalites, are seizing huge swaths of land in eastern India and serving the people in those rural areas which the capitalist Indian state criminally neglects and disempowers. Marxist guerrillas in Colombia are organizing right now on their border to help Venezuela beat back a U.S. invasion if the Trump administration decides to turn this so-called soft coup into a hard one. In Cuba, Leninists overthrew a brutal U.S. puppet dictatorship on that island and successfully defended itself for over half a century from imperialist blockades, sanctions, invasions, and literally hundreds of assassination attempts on its leaders, siphoning what little wealth and resources they can manage to the people of Cuba as opposed to multinational corporations. I could go on in this way for hours if I wanted to, but the point is clear. When it comes to building proletarian power, defending that power against all odds, protecting its people from imperialism, and materially challenging capitalism and imperialism on the global stage, nothing comes close to the effectiveness of Marxist-Leninist movements. And why? Why do these movements do so comparatively well while many other movements fail, get drowned in blood, or forced into alliances with U.S. imperialism, or are isolated in small territories, rendering them a non-threat to global capital? Well, in my opinion, it's precisely because of the sort of strategic thinking and materialist analysis that blossoms out of texts like this one by Lenin. In the face of leftists who invent utopian schemes out of thin air, whose dogmatism and principles before reality approach sweep the legs out from under their proletarian movements, whose inability to think materially and dialectically render themselves and their movements directionless, and who do all of this in the name of Marxism and communism, it is comrades like Lenin who rise to the challenge and systematically apply the methodology of historical materialism to navigate the labyrinth of opportunism, chauvinism, utopianism, and idealism, and to point the way forward for us and for our class. We aren't Leninists because we prefer Lenin's ideas over others. We aren't Leninists because we all secretly want to be the next Lenin. We aren't Leninists because we are hopeless authoritarians who eagerly await the day when we can hold power over others. All of that is empty drivel, dripping stupidly out of the snarling mouths of our enemies. We are Leninists because we are Marxists in the age of imperialism. We are Leninists because we insist on ruthlessly criticizing all that exists. We are Leninists because we are a part of the real movement which aims to abolish the present state of things. We want, from the bottom of our hearts, to overthrow this inhuman, vile, and oppressive global social order and to help bring about a world worth living in. And it's Lenin, like Marx and Engels before him, who so doggedly and consistently assists us in this fight. This work by Lenin is subtitled A Popular Essay in Marxist Strategy and Tactics. And that's essential, because while we may all agree on where we want to go, it's Lenin in works like this one who helps show us the way, who helps equip us with the complexity and depth of strategic thinking that is not only essential for the construction of socialism, but which is increasingly essential for the very survival of our entire species. Alyson?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is really what's crucial, and this text demonstrates it so clearly, that again, Leninism is correct not because it is abstractly the right ideas or principles, but because in practice, as it's tested in the world, it yields results that matter. And really, everything you just said makes me think about what Mao says in On Practice, where he talks about the way that some people think that we are Marxists because Marx is a prophet, and we might say also that we're Leninists because Lenin is a prophet. But in reality, we're both of those things, because looking at and engaging in concrete class struggle testifies to the correctness of Marxism and Leninism. And really what I think is important about this text is that it's Lenin at his most reflexive. Even if we can debate what it means for us today, it's Lenin arguing that abstract dogma is never the correct approach, that adaptation is crucial, and that while adaptation can be a front for opportunism and for right-wing politics, it can also be a necessary way of surviving. And what's distinctive about Leninism is that ability to survive at all costs in a revolutionary context. And I really think that you're onto something by highlighting that being the reason that we're Leninists.
Yeah, absolutely. And we shouldn't shy away from that, you know. We should make that well known, because the stereotypes about us and our tendency are so diametrically opposed to like the realness of what we stand for and what we believe in, that, you know, half of the battle is just clearing out the bullshit stereotypes and putting forward that sort of passionate defense of what we believe and why we believe it. And I think, you know, that goes a long way to clarifying people's misunderstandings, because, you know, they've been inculcated to have a fundamental and intractable, purposeful confusion about what Marxism-Leninism is about and what it aims to do. And other tendencies have been able to sort of avoid that confusion and that sort of mass inculcated stereotype against their own tendencies, precisely because they weren't as successful in the 20th century as Marxist-Leninist movements were around the world. And so the U.S. empire and the Western imperialists and capitalists specifically had all of the reason in the world to specifically target Marxism-Leninism and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism as things to destroy in people's minds, right? To make them seem evil and synonymous with tyranny and authoritarianism. And it's that reason why they did that, because it was so effective. And there's lots of examples of that. But yeah, so that's why I came around over all these years to this side of things. And that's why I'm like, everything I learn and everything I do and everything I read just really reinforces that and makes it more robust. And I blossom in developing my understanding all the time. But it's really this strategic coherency and practical successes in the real world that brought me over. And we should highlight that.
Absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so the other point that I had in terms of applicability, and this is kind of going in a different direction than the other two, but in terms of something that we've talked about before, is really how settler colonialism interacts with the question of parliamentary strategy in the U.S. And I again want to return to that idea, because I think one component of it that we need to think about is the unique settler colonial status here. So if we take the settler colonial status of the U.S. seriously, and if we apply the national question to indigenous nations as well as to the African diaspora within the U.S., then we have to consider that participation within the government of the United States might ultimately be participation within an occupying colonial force. Lenin doesn't really get into the interrelation between colonialism and participation in this text, so I want to raise this question because I think it's important as Marxists in the US for us to constantly be forcing a decolonial perspective into our views on this, and I think that that needs to be pushed into our discussions of what Lenin says as well. So, of course, we understand that socialists have no place among the police or the imperialist military, but I think that we often don't understand the distinction between civilian governance and military occupation can be somewhat artificial. The civilian governance of the US, whether or not it is local government or national government, functions to keep an occupation of this land running smoothly. Even seemingly progressive bills that seek to ameliorate basic social problems ultimately can serve to legitimize a government which operates on and occupies stolen land. And this has to inform the ways we participate within the US government. It might not not rule out participation completely, and again, we should never dogmatically do that at all, but it's a consideration we have to take into account. There are real material ways that the day-to-day governance of elected officials, be they city councilors or U.S. congresswomen, participate in the occupation of indigenous land. The day-to-day management of governmental problems ultimately serves to reinforce and strengthen a settler colonial system. The only way that a socialist in an occupying government could really avoid this role is to opt in favor of obstructionism within a parliamentary context, acting against the duties that they would have within that government and really disrupting the entire process. And there may actually be work for this. This is a tactic socialists have used before, but this seems like really the only way that socialists could participate in the U.S. government without becoming complicit in some level of that settler colonialism. And winning elected positions is a level of participation. Furthermore, given that electoral politics already excludes workers based on racialization, in particular black workers and indigenous workers, and given that participation is predicated on citizenship status, which is denied to many extremely vulnerable immigrant workers in the U.S., why is it that we think that the base for a revolutionary movement is to be made up of those who vote and participate in parliamentary elections? Immigrant agricultural workers excluded from citizenship are much more likely to play a revolutionary role than white-collar retail employees, given their ability to disrupt real intense sites of industrial and agricultural production in the United States if they were organized to do so. Do we really believe that a revolutionary movement in the United States will be led by the demographics who care most about this type of participation, or do we believe it'll be led by those most excluded from it? The settler colonial status of the United States creates real contradictions that we have to specifically deal with now. Access to parliamentary action in the first place is predicated on citizenship, but also on certain other statuses. The United States, for example, still maintains the colonies of Puerto Rico and of Guam, who have people who have technical U.S. citizenship, but cannot vote and have one basically symbolic seat in the legislature that again gets to not vote in the legislature. So there are people within the occupied land of the United States who are a priori excluded from parliamentary struggle on the basis of their colonized status. If we take this seriously, then any mass movement that we build here has to expand beyond just the scope of parliamentarianism into working and organizing with those excluded on a colonial basis. Stalin tells us that the national question is central because it reveals the extent to which anti-colonial struggle is crucial to the struggle against capitalism. The national liberation of the new African diaspora within the occupied United States, as well as the liberation of indigenous nations, would have devastating blows on global imperialism, as these internal nations, which are most primed in many ways to function as a vanguard for revolutionary movements, and perhaps consequently these groups have been most excluded from electoral politics within the United States. I think it is unsurprising that it is the Black Panthers and indigenous movements who often became vanguards within Marxist-Leninism, pushing the most advanced applied theory, because those who are subjected to colonialism here serve a role to play. So the one thing that I want to say when applying this text and its considerations about parliamentarianism to the US today is that we also have to take colonialism into account and the way that participation functions in relation to colonialism. Again, I'm not the last word on this, and I'm not going to be the one who gives the final assessment, but I think this is a consideration that we have to bring into conversation with Lenin and with Marxism in the US. We have to constantly be trying to decolonize our own Marxist conceptions in order to be able to create liberation for those oppressed nations here who play a crucial revolutionary role. So that's the last bit of sort of application and assessment of this text concretely that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and Alyson, that's why I love working with you and I find you to be such a principled comrade, is because you constantly bring up this essential topic and talk about it through a Marxist lens and are really, really convincing with your arguments about it. And you're right, the Black Panther Party at their height were seen in the U.S. as the vanguard, and there's a specific reason why they were so effective, and part of that comes from their status, in this sort of broader white supremacist society, and as an occupied, nation inside of a nation almost. And when it comes to Demsocs and social democrats, similar to the question of imperialism, they almost have to either ignore this question entirely or they're forced into being an explicit chauvinist on this topic. And I've seen you recently on Twitter engage with somebody who took that latter route and just said, fuck it, I'm a chauvinist and I'm going to be proud of it. But a lot of them want to not bring it up and not talk about it. But it has to be a core contradiction of any of those political projects which are premised on sort of maintaining this system or entering it as a vehicle through which we can actually get liberation. And so putting pressure on democratic socialists and social democrats to really face up to this problem and tell us why we should support that movement with this stuff in mind, I think is important. And I'd really like to see, what some of the best minds on those sides of things have to say in response, because I really don't see a way out. Those movements, those strategies of democratic socialism and social democracy are premised on keeping that sort of system in place, and are premised on the idea that this is their land to dominate anyways, right? Like it's premised, like if we win the election and we win through these democratic mechanisms, then we are in power, and that is still perpetuating genocide, perpetuating colonialism, perpetuating all these things that the rotten core of this society are rooted in. And that's not liberation. That's not revolutionary, And so I hope people take that incredibly seriously. We should on the Marxist side for sure. And we should also put pressure on those formations on the left that refuse to really engage with this question.
Definitely, and it's something that I hope the Marxist-Leninist movement on the whole will really latch onto. Our analysis on the national question is one of our distinguishing features, and it really gives us the ability to push this line about internal nations within the U.S. and the necessity of national liberation there, and I hope we're keeping the pressure up on social democrats and other people who do mostly just want to ignore that question.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think that wraps up our episode on left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Thank you so much for everybody who tunes in and supports the show. Again, if you like what we do and you want to get bonus content, you can always support us on patreon.com/The Red Menace. I know last month, me and Alyson basically did an hour-and-a-half Q&A. Really fun, fascinating questions, and I think a lot of people will get a lot out of that, so we totally invite you in to come be a part of that community, and we're going to be trying to do live calls in the very near future as well. So if you're at all interested in sort of building the community with actually the intimacy of phone calls and hearing people's voices and talking in real time, that's something that we here at Red Menace are aiming to do on our Patreon. So definitely support us if you can. We deeply appreciate it. Alyson?
Awesome. Yeah. And real quick, I also wanted to give a shout out to some of our supporters on Patreon who support us at our top tier level, whose support we seriously appreciate. It allows us to keep doing the show with the level that we have, and so much work goes into the show that you assist us in being able to do and put the time towards it. So a really quick thank you to Seth Walker, Dylan Busard, Addington Publishers, Anton Pannekoek, Comrade Garlic Jr., and RB, who are all donating at a top level. Your support means so much to us, as does the support of all of our patrons. We are really thankful for all of your help, and we wouldn't be able to do this show without you.
Definitely. And do we have a text for next month? Did we think of that before?
I don't know if we picked one finally. Okay. What are your thoughts?
I think I want to go in direction of Mao. Read something from Mao.
I'm very down with On Contradiction.
Okay.
If you would like to do that.
Yeah, Alyson and I are literally planning this on the fly, but let's go ahead and do that.
Totally.
So
cool.
On Contradiction for next month, and if you want to get a head start reading that, definitely be our guest. That's the text we'll tackle.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right, solidarity to everybody. Good night.